And you will recall from our previous Torah lesson, we were looking at the chiastic structure of Moses' birth, and we saw how Moses gives us a picture of death and resurrection and the number three. And we make the point at Restoration of Torah Ministries that this is a veiled and shadowy prophecy of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah in 3 days. And so we had said that when we returned for the second half of this teaching, that we would show you how modern rabbis see this picture of death and resurrection. They don't recognize it as messianic prophecy pointing to Yeshua, but I want to show you how they see this nonetheless. And to give you an example, I'm going to take you to a Torah commentary, and this Torah commentary is taken from Har Etzion Yeshiva. Here it is, www.vbm-torah.org. We're going to go into the Parsha series, and then we're going to go into the book of Shemot, and we're going to read the article, The Double Birth of Moses by Rav Elchanan Samet. We're going to skip the first two sections here, and we're going to read this section here entitled The Biblical Stories of Rebirth. And I just want to put this in here. We're actually going to read about most of this section right here. I know you're not going to be able to see the words, but I'm putting this here because I want to show you that the idea, the notion of death, burial, and resurrection that I just presented is not just a wild fancy of a messianic or a Christian believer. You would have someone like maybe Tovia Singer who would make you try to believe so, but we're going to listen to the words of the rabbis themselves. So element C from Rav Elchanan Samet of Har Etzion Yeshiva. Biblical stories of rebirth. The story of Moshe's rebirth belongs to the series of biblical narratives whose subject is the rebirth of the main character. In the story of rebirth, we find a baby, young child, or youth whose life is endangered to the point where he nearly dies. He is miraculously saved from that danger, and his life is returned to him as a gift. The Torah relates to this miracle as a sort of rebirth of the child. The first child whose rebirth is recounted in the Torah is Yishmael. While he wanders about with his mother Hagar in the wilderness of Be'er Sheva, their supply of water runs out. Hagar casts the child under one of the bushes and distances herself, for she said, "Let me not witness the death of the child." An angel reveals himself to her, opening her eyes to see a well of water, and thus Yishmael's life is saved. Yitzchak, too, is born again. Now look at that phrase. Again, I'm not using this. This is from a non-messianic rabbi. And listen to the words that he uses, born again. Yitzchak, too, is born again after being bound to the altar on Mount Moriah. At the last moment, after Abraham has stretched out his hand to seize the knife, the angel intervenes and prevents it. Yosef, or Joseph, too, after being thrown into the pit with the intention that he will die there, is, listen to this, quote, brought back to life, end quote, as it were, when Midianite traders pull him out of the pit and sell him as a slave. After the story of Moshe and his rebirth, we find this motif reappearing in the prophets. In the episode of the resuscitation of the Shunammite woman's son by Elisha in 2 Kings 4, and in the salvation of Joash from the hands of Athaliah by Yehoshua, his sister, in 2 Kings 11, 1-3. In each of these stories, the rebirth signifies the beginning of the child's existence on a different level. His existence is imbued with new destiny. The nature and purpose of this destiny are always connected to the nature of the danger in which he found himself and the way in which he was saved, which themselves always hint at this difference in his future existence. In order to achieve this new level of existence or this new identity, he had to be, listen to this, he had to be at death's door and then merit the miracle of salvation. And the miracle itself and the special circumstances through which it comes about are meant to create a change in the personality of the child, making it clear to him and to all those around them that from now on a new chapter is starting in his life in which his destiny will be realized. A comparison of the above stories reveals several differences between them in various spheres. The dangers that bring up to each of these children, almost to the point of death, are extremely varied, and the unexpected ways in which they are saved vary accordingly. The children in these stories vary in their ages, and so he goes on and talks about and compares these different stories. But what's most important is whereas he talks about the rebirth of the children, he sees the pictures of their death, even as I have said with Moses. And the only difference between the thematic teaching that I'm seeing and that Rav Al-Hanan Summit is seeing is that he calls it rebirth, whereas I prefer to call it resurrection, because even as he said, Joseph too, after being thrown into the pit with the intention that he will die there, is quote unquote brought back to life. That is called resurrection. And he even points to the example of the Shunammite woman's son and sees resurrection. Now, what's important here is that these stories, they all are pictures or veiled shadowy images of death and resurrection. And in many of them, we see the number 3, because Adonai is trying to teach us that the great work of the Messiah is that he will die and resurrect in 3 days. So returning to our outline here, again, we see that these pictures of death and resurrection are plain for anyone to see who studies the scriptures thematically. And I wanted to bring this out because, as I said, when you go to many of the anti-missionaries and people such as Tovia Singer, they would think that this idea of death and resurrection, that is not taught in the Torah. Well, clearly this is taught in the Torah. Here we have a rabbi at Har Etzion Yeshiva himself who is admitting and who is seeing and recognizing that these are pictures of death and rebirth, as he calls it, and I'm simply calling rebirth resurrection, okay? And so that's our thematic teaching for today on the birth of Moses, who is a messianic figure giving us a shadowy picture of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. And we see that the rabbis see these things. They don't recognize them as teaching on death and resurrection in 3 days, but clearly they are. Moses, mother hid him for 3 months. There's the number 3. Isaac at the Akedah. He was about to die. It took him and his father 3 days to find Mount Moriah. You have the example of Jonah in the large fish for 3 days and 3 nights, which is exactly how long the Messiah was in the tomb. And then you have the example of Daniel, who prayed 3 times a day. He was one of 3 advisors over the 120 satraps. And the decree that King Darius was tricked into making was that no one could pray to any other god for 30 days. And again, the most significant digit is what's most important. And so again, I hope you enjoyed this thematic teaching from the story of Moses' birth. May Adonai bless you in the name of Yeshua.